June 28, 1942 to 47 in the morning, the skies above the Caucasus front. Senior Lieutenant Yevdokia Bershinskaya sat in the cockpit of her Polikarpov Po-2 biplane and watched the stars disappear behind German searchlights. The canvas wings trembled. In the night wind, the wooden frame creaked beneath her. She was 2,000 feet above enemy territory, and she had just cut her engine. Complete silence. Beside her sat her navigator, 19-year-old Klavdia Fomacheva from a small village outside Moscow. The girl had never seen an airplane until 6 months ago. Now she was gliding silently over German positions with 200 kilograms of bombs beneath her feet. The only sound was wind rushing through the wing struts, a soft whooshing, like fabric tearing through air, like witches on broomsticks. Bershinskaya was 31 years old. She had learned to fly in 1930 at a local aero club, one of thousands of Soviet women who joined aviation programs during the 1930s. She had instructed students, ferried mail planes, and competed in regional flying competitions. She never imagined she would command a regiment of women, flying combat missions against the German WWIIStorys. Below them, German soldiers heard the sound, that eerie whistling cutting through the darkness. By the time they looked up, the bombs were already falling. The Po-2 pulled up hard, engine roaring back to life, disappearing into the black sky before the anti-aircraft guns could find her. Klavdia marked the target on her map. Direct hit. Bershinskaya turned the aircraft south toward their airfield. They had 17 more missions to fly before sunrise. This was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the only all-female bomber unit in the Soviet Air Force. The Germans called them Nachthexen, night witches. They flew 30,000 combat missions during the war. Some pilots flew 18 sorties in a single night. 23 of them received Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor their country could give. 32 of them never came home. This is the story of the women who turned crop dusters into weapons of war, who flew without parachutes, without radios, without guns, who terrified the most powerful military machine in Europe with nothing but canvas, wood, and courage the world said women did not possess. This is the story the Soviet Union tried to bury, and the story the West never knew existed. The night witches were born from desperation and one woman's refusal to accept no for an answer. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the Red Army was caught completely unprepared. Within weeks, entire divisions were encircled and destroyed. By autumn, German forces were advancing on Moscow. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies. Soviet losses were catastrophic. Every available pilot was thrown into combat. They were not enough. Marina Roskova was already a national hero when the war began. She was a navigator who had set multiple long-distance flight records in the 1930s. In 1938, she and 2 other women flew from Moscow to the Far East, crash landing in the Siberian wilderness after running out of fuel. Roskova survived 10 days alone in the taiga before being rescued. Stalin personally awarded her the Hero of the Soviet Union. She was 26 years old. When the war started, Roskova was inundated with letters, thousands of them, from women across the Soviet Union begging to be allowed to fight. Young women who had trained in aviation clubs, who had learned to fly gliders and biplanes, who were willing to do anything to defend their country. The military rejected them all. Women could serve as nurses, as radio operators, as support staff, not as combat pilots. Roskova went directly to Stalin She had access that few others possessed. She was a symbol of Soviet achievement, proof that Soviet women could accomplish anything. She told Stalin that women pilots were a resource the Soviet Union could not afford to waste. He listened. On October 8, 1941, Stalin signed Order No. 0099, authorizing the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments, fighter pilots, dive bombers, and night bombers. Raskova was given complete authority to organize, train, and command them. She immediately began recruiting. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, 2,000 women had applied. Raskova selected approximately 400. They came from every corner of the Soviet Union. University students and factory workers, poets and engineers, girls from collective farms who had learned to fly in local aero clubs. Most were between 17 and 26 years old. Some lied about their age to get in. They were sent to Engels, a town on the Volga River, for training. They had 6 months to transform from civilians into combat pilots. The instructors were skeptical. Many were openly hostile. These were girls, not soldiers. How could they possibly survive combat? The women were issued men's uniforms. Everything was too large. Boots fell off their feet. Pants had to be cinched with rope. They tore up bedsheets to stuff into their boots so they could walk. They looked ridiculous. They did not care. They learned navigation, aerobatics, formation flying, bomb targeting. They studied aircraft mechanics, dismantling engines and reassembling them by hand. They trained in freezing temperatures, often without adequate food or heat. Some washed out. Most stayed. They were determined to prove themselves. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was assigned the Polikarpov Po-2. It was an insult disguised as an assignment. The Po-2 was a training aircraft designed in 1928. It was made of plywood covered in canvas fabric. It had an open cockpit, no armor, no radio, and no weapons except the bombs it carried. Its maximum speed was 94 miles per hour. A German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter could fly 3 times that fast. The Po-2 was obsolete before the war even started, but Yevdokia Bershinskaya, now commander of the 588th, saw potential where others saw limitations. The Po-2 was slow. That meant it could fly low, hugging the terrain, staying beneath radar. It was quiet. That meant it could approach targets without being heard. It was simple. That meant it required minimal maintenance and could be repaired in the field with basic tools, and most importantly, it was stable. That meant it could be flown by pilots with limited experience. Bershinskaya developed the tactics that would make the Night Witches legendary. They would fly only at night. They would approach targets in formations of 3. 2 aircraft would attract searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, weaving and dodging to draw attention. The 3rd would cut her engine at altitude and glide silently to the target. She would drop her bombs, restart the engine, and escape before the Germans realized what had happened. Then they would rotate. The decoy became the bomber. The bomber became the decoy. Over and over until all aircraft had dropped their payloads. It required perfect coordination, nerves of steel, and absolute trust in your sisters. The regiment arrived at the front in May 1942. The skepticism they had faced in training intensified. Male pilots ridiculed them. Ground crews refused to service their aircraft. Commanders did not believe women could handle combat. Then the Night Witches flew their first mission. They targeted a German headquarters near the Caucasus front. All aircraft returned safely. Direct hits on every target. The male pilots stopped laughing. Within weeks, the Germans learned to fear the sound of wind through canvas wings. The whooshing was unlike anything else on the battlefield. When the Poe cut its engine and glided, the only sound was air rushing through the wooden wing struts and the canvas skin. It was soft, almost gentle, but it meant death was coming. German soldiers called it Hexenbesen, the sound of witches' broomsticks. They would hear it in the darkness and dive for cover, knowing that bombs would fall within seconds. The psychological impact was devastating. Entire units would refuse to sleep at night. Terrified of that sound, the Luftwaffe put a bounty on the night witches. Any pilot who shot down a Poe would automatically receive the Iron Cross. It was the same honor given for destroying a far more valuable bomber or shooting down multiple enemy fighters. That is how much the Germans feared these women in wooden planes. But shooting down a Poe was harder than it seemed. The aircraft was so slow that German fighters struggled to engage them. A Messerschmitt's stall speed, the minimum speed it could fly without falling out of the sky, was higher than the Poe-2's maximum speed. German pilots had to drop their flaps, lower their landing gear, and slow to dangerously low speeds just to stay behind the biplanes. Several German fighters stalled and crashed, trying to shoot down night witches. The real danger came from anti-aircraft fire. Searchlights would sweep the sky, trying to catch the Poe south in their beams. Once illuminated, the canvas aircraft became easy targets. Tracer rounds and flak shells would fill the air. A single hit could ignite the fabric and turn the entire plane into a fireball. The women flew without parachutes. There was no room. The Poe could barely carry a pilot, a navigator, and bombs. Adding parachutes meant reducing the bomb load. Berschenskaya made the decision. Bombs were more valuable than safety. If you were hit, you went down with your plane. They flew without radios, too heavy. Navigation was done by map and compass, using landmarks memorized during daylight reconnaissance. On cloudy nights when stars were not visible, navigators would lean out of the cockpit and identify terrain. Features by moonlight, rivers, roads, forests. If you got lost, you were on your own. They flew in cold that should have killed them. The open cockpits offered no protection from the wind. At altitude in winter, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Frostbite was not a risk. It was a certainty. The women would return from missions with frozen faces, their goggles crusted with ice, unable to feel their hands. Irina Sabrova flew 1,008 combat missions, more than any other woman in the regiment. She described the physical toll. The cold would cut through your flight suit like knives. Your hands would go numb on the controls. Ice would form on your eyelashes, making it hard to see. You would land between missions, and ground crew would have to pry your hands off the stick. Because your fingers had frozen in place, the missions were relentless. A typical night would begin at dusk. The women would receive their targets: German supply depots, troop concentrations, artillery positions, rail yards. They would plan their approach routes, memorizing landmarks. Then they would walk to their aircraft. The Poe south were lined up along the edge of the airfield. Each plane had a two-person crew, pilot and navigator. The navigator sat in the front cockpit with the maps and bomb release mechanism. The pilot sat in the rear cockpit with the controls. They would perform pre-flight checks by hand, running their fingers along the canvas to check for tears, testing the control surfaces, verifying that the bombs were properly secured. Then they would take off, one after another, climbing into the darkness. The flight to the target might take 30 minutes or an hour, depending on distance. They flew low, sometimes only 100 meters above the ground, following rivers and roads to avoid getting lost. As they approached the target, they would climb to 2,000 or 3,000 meters, high enough to glide to the target and escape. Then the engine would go silent. Nadia Popova, one of the most decorated night witches, described the moment. You would pull the throttle back and cut the ignition. The roar of the engine would stop. Suddenly you could hear everything: the wind, the creaking of the wings, your own heartbeat. Below you, the German encampment would be lit by campfires and vehicle headlights. You could see soldiers moving. You could hear them talking. You would put the nose down slightly and glide, adjusting your angle with the control stick. The navigator would call out directions: left, right, steady. When you were directly over the target, she would pull the release. The bombs would fall away. The plane would lurch upward, suddenly lighter. Then you would slam the throttle forward and hit the ignition. The engine would cough, sputter, and roar back to life. You would pull up hard, climbing as steeply as the Po-2 could manage. Behind you, the bombs would detonate. Searchlights would snap toward you. Tracer fire would arc through the sky. You would weave and dodge, staying low, trying to disappear into the darkness. If you were lucky, you made it back to the airfield. You would land, and ground crew would immediately begin refueling and rearming. 2 minutes. That was all the rest you got. Then you would take off again, and again, and again. 18 missions in a single night was not unusual. Some pilots flew more. Yevdokia Nozel once flew 18 missions in one night. That meant 18 takeoffs, 18 flights over enemy territory, 18 glides with the engine cut, 18 bomb drops, 18 escapes through searchlights and flak. By the time the sun rose, she could barely stand. The losses were inevitable. On July 31st, 1943, Yevgenia Rudnova was killed when her Po-2 was shot down during a mission over the Taman Peninsula. She was 24 years old. Before the war, she had been a brilliant astronomer, studying at Moscow University. She navigated by the stars she had spent her life studying. She had flown 645 combat missions. She died 2 weeks before her regiment received their Guards designation, one of the highest honors in the Soviet military. Her best friend, Nadia Popova, painted Rudnova's name on the side of her aircraft and carried her into every mission after. Kotya Ryabova and her navigator Nadia Ulyanenko were shot down on August 1st, 1943. The night after Rudnova died, their plane was caught in searchlights over a German position. Flak tore through the canvas. The Po-2 ignited and fell burning from the sky. They were 20 and 21 years old. Polina Gelman flew 860 combat missions and survived the war. She described what it felt like when someone did not return. You would be circling the airfield, waiting to land after a mission. You would count the planes. One missing. You would land and ask the ground crew, "Did she come back?" They would shake their heads, and you would know your sister was gone. But there was no time to grieve. You had another mission in 2 minutes. The night witches developed rituals to cope with the losses. When someone died, her belongings would be gathered and sent to her family. Her name would be painted on other aircraft. The remaining pilots would toast her memory with whatever alcohol they could find, usually Rotgut vodka or medical ethanol. Then they would fly again. By 1943, the night witches had become legends on both sides of the front. Soviet propaganda celebrated them as symbols of female empowerment and Soviet superiority. Posters showed beautiful women in flight gear, fierce and determined. Newspaper articles praised their bravery. They were proof that Soviet women were the equals of men, capable of any task the motherland required. The reality was more complicated. The male pilots and commanders, who had initially dismissed the women, now relied on them. The night witches flew missions that no one else wanted. Dangerous low-altitude attacks on fortified positions. Harassment bombing that prevented German troops from sleeping or regrouping. Precision strikes that required navigating by landmarks in total darkness. They were effective because they were fearless. They had nothing to prove to anyone except themselves. Nadezhda Popova became one of the most decorated pilots in the regiment. She flew 850 to combat missions. Her aircraft was shot down multiple times. On one mission, her plane was hit by flak and caught fire. She and her navigator managed to extinguish the flames by smothering them with their maps and bare hands, suffering severe burns in the process. They completed the mission and flew back to base. When they landed, ground crew counted 40 bullet holes in the canvas. Popova kept flying. She was shot down again weeks later. This time the plane crashed behind enemy lines. She and her navigator survived the impact and spent 3 days evading German patrols, walking at night and hiding during the day. They made it back to Soviet lines on foot. Popova was back in the cockpit within a week. When asked years later why she kept flying, Popova said simply, "We were defending our country." There was no question of not flying. The bond between the women of the 588th was unlike anything else in the Soviet military. They called each other sisters, not metaphorically, literally. They shared everything: food, clothing, letters from home. When one woman received a package from her family, she would distribute the contents among the entire regiment. When someone was killed, the others would write to her family, describing how bravely she had died, how much she had been loved. They protected each other. If a pilot was struggling, her wingmates would cover for her, flying extra missions so she could rest. If someone made a mistake, the others would take the blame. Bershanskaya, their commander, shielded them from the worst of the military bureaucracy. Fighting to keep her regiment together and her women safe, they celebrated together. Between missions, they would sing folk songs from their villages, popular songs from before the war, songs they made up about flying and about the Germans they were hunting. They would dance, teaching each other steps from different regions. Of the Soviet Union, they would tell stories, read poetry, write letters. They were young. Most were in their early 20s. They should have been in university, falling in love, starting careers. Instead, they were flying wooden airplanes into anti-aircraft fire night after night. But they found joy where they could. By 1945, the night witches had flown from the Caucasus to Berlin. They had supported the defense of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles in human history. They had flown missions during the liberation of Crimea, over the Balkans, through Poland, and into Germany itself. They dropped 23,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They flew 30,000 combat sorties. They helped win the war. On May 9, 1945, the day Germany surrendered, the women of the 588th gathered at their airfield in Poland. They had survived. Not all of them. 30 had been killed in action. But the regiment had endured. They had proven everything they set out to prove. Then the Soviet Union told them to go home and be quiet. The Night Witches were disbanded almost immediately after the war ended. No victory parade through Red Square. No public recognition. The Soviet government decided that women in combat did not fit the post-war narrative they wanted to tell. Veterans were encouraged to return to traditional roles: marriage, motherhood, factory work. The West never knew they existed. During the Cold War, Soviet military history was carefully controlled. The Night Witches were mentioned briefly in official histories, but never in detail. No books were written about them. No films were made. They became a footnote. Nadesia Popova went back to her village and became a flight instructor. Irina Sabrova returned to Moscow and worked in aviation administration. Polina Gelman became an engineer. They lived quiet lives. They did not talk much about the war. In the West, the story of female Soviet pilots was dismissed as propaganda. Surely women had not really flown combat missions. Surely this was Soviet exaggeration, an attempt to claim superiority in the realm of gender equality. Western historians ignored them. Military analysts did not study their tactics. The Night Witches disappeared from history. It was not until the 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to open, that their stories started to emerge. Researchers gained access to military archives. Journalists interviewed the surviving veterans, now elderly women in their 60s and 70s. Books were published in Russian, then translated. Documentaries were made. Slowly, the world learned what these women had done. In 1995, the Russian government finally honored the Night Witches with a formal memorial. A statue was erected showing a female pilot in flight gear, looking toward the sky. The surviving members of the 588th gathered for the dedication. There were fewer than a dozen of them left. Nadezhda Popova attended. She was 74 years old. She stood in front of the memorial and wept, not for herself, for the 30 who never came home, for Yevgenia Rudneva, who had navigated by stars, for Kotya and Nadia, who had burned in the sky over Taman, for all the young women who had died before they could live. Popova died in 2013 at the age of 91. Irina Sabrova, the pilot with 1,008 missions, died in 2000. Polina Gelman died in 2005. One by one, the Night Witches passed away, taking their stories with them. But their legacy endures. In 2013, Putin awarded the remaining Night Witches the Order for Service to the Fatherland. There were only a handful left to receive it. In 2017, a Russian film called Night Swallows told their story to a new generation. Monuments have been erected in their honor across Russia and Ukraine. In the West, they have become symbols of forgotten women warriors. Books, podcasts, and articles celebrate their bravery. Young women learning to fly cite the Night Witches as inspiration. They have become icons of what women can achieve when given the chance. But perhaps the most fitting tribute comes not from governments or historians, but from the German soldiers who heard that sound. In the darkness, decades after the war, researchers interviewed Wehrmacht veterans about their experiences on the Eastern Front. Many spoke of the cold, the brutality, the relentless Soviet offensives. And many spoke of the nights, the sound they never forgot. That soft whooshing cutting through the darkness, the sound of wind through canvas, the sound of death approaching silently. One veteran said, "We would rather face an entire tank division than hear that sound again." The Night Witches proved something the world was not ready to accept in 1942. That courage has no gender. That women could be warriors as fierce as any man. That some of the deadliest pilots in the sky wore lipstick under their flight goggles and braided their hair before missions. They flew 30,000 missions in aircraft that should not have been weapons. They terrified the most powerful military in Europe with nothing but wood, canvas, and refusal to be afraid. And when German soldiers heard that whooshing sound in the night, they knew the witches were flying and someone was not going to see morning.